I was a school teacher in Australia, and I came to Vietnam in 2002, looking for a job, wondering what I was going to end up doing. I picked up a job teaching English in a university. So I was teaching master's level economics students, which was quite different to what I was used to. And while I was doing that, I was also meeting children, homeless kids who were here in Hanoi. At that time, when you walked around the streets of the city, you'd see them everywhere, shining shoes or selling something. And I got to know just a few of them. Started to teach a bit of English because that was what I did. And once kids out there on the streets knew that there was someone willing to help them, they started to come in larger and larger numbers. Some of my university students then found out about that. They were young adults in their mid-20s, late 20s, and they saw an opportunity to do some good in the world. So we joined forces and started running regular classes for street kids, running a football club, and things just kept on growing until we got where we are today. Blue Dragon started because we saw that there were street children who needed help, and we really didn't see anybody else who could help them. We tried. In fact, we tried really hard in our early days to not start an organisation. We looked around to see who else could help these kids. And at that time, no one else was in a position to do so. There were some other organisations helping, but they couldn't help kids who were 13 or 14 years old, for example. Maybe they could provide training once the kids reached 17 and 18. So in our early days, we were filling a need where there was really nobody else who could help those kids. Now that was some time ago, and Vietnam has grown and developed incredibly since then. But Blue Dragon keeps adapting along the way to meet the needs that nobody else is meeting. So in Vietnam, we are organising rescues of girls, women, and also boys and men who've been trafficked either into sex or labour exploitation. And we're finding those young people who have been trafficked and who nobody else can find. We're then giving services until they are no longer in need of intensive support. And the same with street children. We're still the only organisation in Vietnam that's going out on the streets looking for homeless children, providing shelter, and we provide a continuum of services. So we'll meet kids when they're in crisis, and we'll work with them right through until they're no longer in crisis at all. They may finish up in jobs. They may go through university with our support. So we provide a unique service in Vietnam, and we keep adapting as the needs of children change. Whatever they become, we adapt to meet that need. From the outside, looking at Blue Dragon, it seems that we have a whole array of different programs and activities. But what threads it all together is that we work with kids who are in crisis for the long term. So when we meet kids, we may be in a position where we need to rescue them from some terrible situation. And that could be that they're being held in slavery against their will. It could be that they are homeless on the street and being abused and pimped out or addicted to drugs. So the very first time that we encounter the children, our service to them is a rescue service. And that's reaching out with care, offering a helping hand. Once they're with us, we have a whole array of services for them immediately. Things like shelter, legal advocacy, so we can take them to a police station to make a statement, and make sure that the police can investigate if the children have been the victim of a crime. We have psychology services, and then reunion services, helping the kids get home to their family if that's appropriate. And a lot of the time it is. If it's not going to work out, then we have emergency accommodation that the kids can stay in. And once they're through that immediate period of sorting out how to resolve an immediate crisis, making sure they're healthy and well and safe, we then move on to those longer term services, getting the kids back in school, Sometimes the children have never been in school before. So we've had kids up to 16 years old going into grade 1. We also have young people growing through our services and eventually going on to tertiary education and then employment. And we're with them all the way through that. If they need accommodation, we'll provide that, although our first port of call is always to see if there's a family member or a member of the community who they could appropriately live with. So it's a very end-to-end service. And finally, we take all that we learn from that whole process to the government. And that may be through the police or through the social affairs department, and see how what we are learning and seeing can feed into law reform and policy development. So through this process, we've been able to have laws changed to offer better protection to children in crisis. At any one point in time, we're helping about 1,500 kids throughout Vietnam. Now, they might be kids here in Hanoi, maybe they're living here in slum areas or growing up on the streets or living in a very disadvantaged family. So here in an urban setting, the kids face particular social pressures. They may encounter drugs, prostitution and so on. Our work also takes us out of the city. A lot of street kids who are here in Hanoi are actually not from Hanoi. By far, most are from rural areas and have migrated in. So we'll then be taking them home. And they could be from the outskirts of the city, or they could be from up the mountains in the northwest or in central Vietnam. They may be from ethnic minority communities. And especially in our rescue work of girls who've been trafficked for sex, there's a very strong overrepresentation of girls and women coming from ethnic minority groups. Vietnam has about 9 million ethnic minority people, and although they are a small portion of the population, they are more likely to be targeted by human traffickers. So Blue Dragon has focused our work in rural areas to making sure that communities from ethnic minority groups such as the Khmer and the Hmong and many of the others, there are 53 communities altogether, that they are more resilient to human trafficking. Now, they might be living in mountains or they might be living down by the lagoons in central Vietnam. So there's a very broad range of people who we help. Every child who we meet at Blue Dragon is incredibly different. It's very unusual to find two children who have a similar story. Now, just recently we've been working with one boy named T, and he came to us actually more than a year ago. We first met him out on the streets, and our staff got to know him, but he didn't want to come into Blue Dragon. At times he would actually go home to his family in the countryside, and then he'd end up back in Hanoi. And he was very friendly with our outreach team, but he didn't want the protection and services that we were offering. As we got to know him, we learned that his home situation was really quite dire. He was being brutally beaten, not by his parents, but by an older brother. And the parents really loved T, but they don't seem to be able to control the older brother's behaviour. And so T was turning up with bruises, sometimes with broken bones, and eventually he ran away from home. And the very first time he ran away, he was only 9 years old. And even now he's 14 and he's still a very small kid, skinny and quite short. So I can't imagine what he was like at the age of 9. And he used to live in trees on the outskirts of Hanoi. He'd pick the fruit and sell it to have a little bit of money to survive. And even one day he actually fell out of the tree and broke both of his legs and dragged himself to hospital. So this is a kid who was in all sorts of trouble, but fiercely independent. So finally, T came to trust Blue Dragon enough that he would come in and visit our centre, and then he accepted a place in our emergency accommodation. And he's been there for a few weeks now. We've been out talking to his family, seeing what we can do. We hope that he'll be able to reunite and move back in with his mum and dad. But obviously we have to make sure he's perfectly safe to do so. Being with Blue Dragon gives him a chance to have a break from the family. He's not out on the street, he's not living in a tree. And his parents also have time to think what they're going to do to make their home safe. In fact, we consider ourselves at Blue Dragon to be pioneers. And that's both a source of pride to us and also sometimes a source of fear, because we do deliberately step out to do things that aren't being done. We actually consider that that's part of our reason for being here. It's not necessarily a source of pride in that we like to gloat that we're doing something no one else is doing. In fact, if we do our job well, others will do what we're doing and we can move on. So when we started working with street children, that work was considered very, very sensitive in Vietnam and very difficult and dangerous sometimes. So not many people wanted to touch that kind of work. Now, helping street kids is considered a relatively mainstream thing, not entirely embraced and accepted by everyone, but we are able to do a lot more now in collaboration with the government and the police than we ever dreamt that we could. So we've moved the barriers, we've shifted the goalposts in a way from don't go there to it's okay to help those kids. And the next stage, which is our real success, will be if we can then bring in more organisations or support other people to start organisations that will help the kids here. So we are pioneers in that we do things that others aren't doing, but we also want to make sure that others can follow us down that path. Our legal advocacy work is another example. Now, there are other people doing some legal advocacy work in Vietnam. We're not the only ones, but we are the only ones that I know of who offer that service to absolutely any young person in crisis. So children can walk in our front gate and no questions asked, they can talk to a lawyer. And that lawyer can see them through a process that might involve going back to their countryside to work with their local government, helping them get paperwork together, going to court, representing them in court, and helping them enroll in school or get any other administrative tasks done that they need to get on with their life. So we don't set up barriers for the young people by saying that they need their paperwork before they come to see us. They don't need to be registered to get our help. They just need to be genuinely in need. And we hope that we'll see others following that path as well, knocking down the barriers that actually stop disadvantaged people from getting help. Our legal advocacy work started quite incidentally. It certainly wasn't planned. As much as I'd like to take credit for the brilliant idea, it was actually just that I met a law student at a school for blind children one day, and he offered to volunteer. And at that time, Blue Dragon was just in the earlier stages. I don't think we had any staff at all then. We were all just volunteers. And my first thought was, what would we need a lawyer for? Turns out that I was wrong about that. In fact, the legal advocacy department now is absolutely core to our work. So they are leading the rescue operations that we do. And that means that they receive the calls for help from Vietnamese people who've been trafficked, either domestically or abroad, and work out where they are and how to get them home. Now, we do that as much as possible in conjunction with police. Sometimes we have to do that on our own, but we always make sure that the police know what we're doing. So there's an advocacy role even to the rescues, that it's not just about finding one person, it's about making sure the whole system knows about this person and can support her or him when they're back, and that we're constantly reviewing, how did this happen? How can someone be trafficked? and therefore, how can we stop it happening again? So the lawyers lead that work, and they're uniquely positioned to oversee that whole process. Not only the rescue, which involves a lot of investigation, analysing information, but also right through to looking at laws and policy to review what they say and how they could be improved. The lawyers also in Blue Dragon have a very significant role in helping people get their legal paperwork together. Now, we're not a very big organisation, and yet we've helped about 11,000 Vietnamese people get their paperwork. And that means things like birth certificates for people whose births were never registered at the time they were born, or ID cards, household papers, all the sort of documentation that most of us take for granted and never think twice about. But without it, you can't do anything. You can't go to school. You can't get a job. You can't get a motorbike license and drive yourself to work. So it's absolutely critical. But thousands and thousands of people in Vietnam just don't have that paperwork. So our lawyers have taken a leading role there in finding areas where a lot of people don't have that paperwork and helping them to get it. And then we have a flow of people all the time in need of advice and support. One of our boys here, his mother has gone to work in Saudi Arabia as a domestic servant, and no one has heard from her for more than 6 months. So our lawyers are coordinating with various agencies, mostly in Vietnam, to work out where she is. And there might end up being a criminal investigation into this later on. We have kids who've been victims of abuse. Sometimes our kids break the law themselves. We've had children from one of our shelters go and break into somebody's house and they get arrested. And even though they've done the wrong thing, they still need and deserve legal representation. So our lawyers are often in court. In fact, our court advocacy is increasing. The more we rescue people who've been trafficked, the more we need to represent them in court once their traffickers have been arrested. So all of that makes for a very busy legal team. And without them, we couldn't do all of the other work that we're doing. People are often surprised that Blue Dragon, as a children's charity, has in-house lawyers working full-time on a salary. It's a very modest salary, but they are permanent staff. In fact, the sort of work that they do is something that could never be outsourced. When they are doing rescue operations, that's life-threatening. They have to know their stuff, they have to be willing to put themselves on the line. And people don't call for help between 9 to 5. In fact, a lot of the calls that we deal with, a lot of the work we have to do is at night time. If you're trapped in a brothel in China, maybe the only time you can use a telephone is 3 or 4 in the morning when other people have gone to sleep and no one knows that you have that phone. So our lawyers have to be ready 24 hours a day for those phone calls. Their work also involves going out into villages, up mountains, sometimes going through jungles to find a community where people are missing from, or taking home a girl who has been trafficked and getting her back to her family. The lawyers often do that with social workers or psychologists because the reunion process may involve also working with local police and local government officials. So it's the kind of work that you can't do from an office. Very, very often if you come and visit Blue Dragon, ask to meet our lawyers, they actually won't be sitting at their desks. It would be a very rare day that they're sitting in an office. Their work is out on the streets, out in the countryside, up the mountains, where the people are. I use the word rescue when I talk about what we do helping people who've been trafficked. It's an emotive word and sometimes a bit controversial, but in fact, it's actually what we do. So someone who has been trafficked, maybe a young woman has been lured away from Vietnam thinking she was traveling with a friend, and she ends up being sold into a forced marriage or a brothel probably in China. The point where we become involved is where that young woman gets her hands on a telephone. She might borrow one or steal one, find one, and she doesn't call us, she calls her mother. Every single rescue starts with a phone call to the mum. The mum calls the police, and the police will open an investigation, but they might also suggest to the mum to talk to us because we have some additional resources to help. So we'll then be in phone contact, not regularly, and sometimes these women have to turn the phone off for most of the day, and they might just have 5 minutes a day when it's safe to turn the phone back on. So we'll communicate with them in that window of time, narrow down where they are, and then we will either go ourselves if we need to find them, or we may be able to send others in, people who we've been working with. We don't confront traffickers. We do not do anything violent. We do not pay traffickers for the release of the people that they have in slavery. What we do is we help people escape from where they are. And then we run back to the border and do a legal crossing from China back into Vietnam. So we present to the police, we ask for their assistance, and what we find is, both in China and in Vietnam, police want to stop human trafficking. So they are more than willing to facilitate a handover of the young woman or the girl. She comes back into Vietnam, and we then work with police here on this side of the border to make sure the traffickers are going to be arrested. Over the years, what we see is that traffickers may target an area, and sometimes we call that a hotspot for trafficking, where people seem particularly vulnerable to being trafficked. But those hotspots will shift and change all the time. Traffickers are very agile in the way that they work. Now, Blue Dragon has set up centres in a couple of areas around the country, both in northern and northwest Vietnam and in central Vietnam, where we found that young people were particularly being trafficked within the country for labour exploitation. So traffickers had identified certain communities that were very, very poor. Children were dropping out of school, and traffickers were going and offering them what they said were training and employment opportunities, but in fact it was slavery. And so we worked directly with those communities while also doing rescue work to get the kids out of there, to get businesses closed down, traffickers arrested, and then the children home. With the trafficking into China, which we also deal extensively with, and that's mostly girls and women, but it can be males as well for labour exploitation. Those people who are trafficked, they could really be from anywhere in the country. Certainly there's a predominance of victims of trafficking from the northern provinces, where the borders are very porous. People don't recognise the border. You know, when you're living in a little mountain village and across the stream is another country, you don't pay any attention to that stream. You might just wander over there, you might even work there in the daytime and walk back home at night. So obviously in those areas, traffickers are a lot more able to take people away from their home. But we've rescued people from the southern states of Vietnam as well, from provinces deep in the south of Ho Chi Minh City. So this isn't a problem that you can address in just one location. And even though we're mostly dealing with the trafficking of people into China, you have to be aware that people from Vietnam can be trafficked anywhere at all, including to England, other places in Europe, and of course within Vietnam. So any program that focuses especially on one instance of trafficking is likely to fail, because all that will happen is it will just shift to another location. You need to take a very comprehensive view of trafficking and be prepared to deal with it in any instance. We did our first rescue of a child trafficked within Vietnam in 2005, and our very first rescue of somebody trafficked into China was in 2007. But our rescue work didn't really ramp up until 2010, 2011, when we really started to develop expertise and were able to go on rescue operations that would bring home 20 young people at a time. Now we're rescuing well over 100 young people each year, mostly from China, from brothels and from forced marriages in China. And by the end of 2018, we expect that we'll have rescued over 800 people altogether. So that's 800 lives, people who otherwise could not have been set free. So we're pretty proud of that. It's really important to us not only that we get children to safety, but that the people who have hurt them face justice. Now, we do not gloat, we do not take pride or pleasure in people being arrested and sentenced to prison, but we see that as part of the healing process. What we see, whether it's boys being sexually exploited on the streets of the city or girls and women being trafficked and sold into slavery in China, knowing that the trafficker has faced a punishment for what they did is absolutely essential in the long-term recovery. Otherwise, there's a lingering sense of injustice and unfairness. How can someone do this to me? And society lets them do it. That's the question that all of these survivors of trafficking and exploitation have to ask themselves. So we've committed resources not only to the rescue process, but also to that justice process. And normally, the very people who were involved in the rescue of a girl in China will one day be standing in court on her behalf while the traffickers are sentenced. We will seek compensation, financial compensation, which doesn't change lives. Sometimes it can be very, very helpful in setting up a business or in recovering some lost money. But the real value of that is in a concrete manifestation of justice being done, of the woman or the girl or the boy knowing that someone was punished because of what they did to them. When this work started, I was living here in Hanoi. I'd come to Vietnam thinking I was going to have an easy life, and I saw these kids who in some way I identified with. I'd never been a street kid, but I was certainly very poor when I was growing up. For some years my family didn't even have a house. We lived in caravans on a block of land. We always had food in our bellies. You know, we never went hungry, but we didn't have any kind of luxuries at all, and life was really hard. So when I was here seeing these kids, I realized that could very easily have been me. And when I saw the joy that they took in learning, I guess that appealed to the teacher in me. And I saw these are kids who, if you help just a little bit, it makes such a huge difference in their lives. As I got to know the kids, I faced the question, do I start an organization? Do I stay forever? Do I abandon my dream of the easy life? I dreamt of going swimming on the beaches of southern Vietnam and drinking beer through the evening. But I realized this was something that I could do. You know, I could actually help these kids. I had the power to get them into school, to help them with their study, to help them have justice done when something went wrong for them. And so I felt that I should do it. And that's not a sense of I should do it just as an obligation, but if I can change someone's life, why wouldn't I do that? And now what Blue Dragon has built into goes well beyond me. It's now an organization filled with people who have that same belief that I have, that we can do this. We can actually make something happen here. And it may be on an individual scale. It might be one child who would otherwise be living in a tree and terrified of going home. We can change his life. But what if we can also ramp that up and change laws that will make life better for everybody? What if we can help others understand the issues facing homeless children or women and girls who've been trafficked into another country? Then we're impacting millions of lives. So I guess we're motivated and inspired by the possibility of making life better for people who are ultimately good people, but who have just had terrible things happen to them. We have kids come in our centre who we think are just angels, kids who are full of life, who would do no wrong. And yet when we meet their family and their community, we'll hear these stories of how they've robbed people, they've broken something, they've sworn, they've dropped out of school, they've done everything wrong. Well, what we can see is that when you give kids the chance to be good people, and when you believe that they will be, well, they are. And when you expect that they're no-hopers, that they're going to do the wrong thing, well, that's exactly what you get from them. So we're seeing that all we have to do is believe in them and create the conditions for them that will let them do what they want to do anyway. Go to school, get a job, grow up and have a family and look after the people around them. When they have that chance, that's exactly what they'll do. That inspires us every single day.